To you who believe, he is precious. But now, to the disobedient. And this is where we see some interplay from the life of Jesus. Verse 7. This stone which the builders rejected. That word builders literally is an expert. An expert. When you want something done and done right, you hire an expert. When you want something done cheap and quick, you hire me. Well, don't laugh, because we could probably hire you too for something, right? Unless you are the expert. Well, notice what he's saying here. The experts rejected him. Now, remember to whom Peter is writing. He's writing back in chapter 1, verse 1, to the pilgrims of the dispersion. The pilgrims of the dispersion. The question is, are these the people? This is what I'm thinking. These are the people whom Nero kicked out of Rome and sent them packing. And then Nero was involved in creating that great persecution, and eventually created a situation where all the people began to blame the Christians for what Nero did as Rome burned. And so he's talking to these Christians, persecuted Christians. And he's saying that you accept Jesus, but the experts rejected him. So if he's writing to these Jews and the experts rejected him, who do you think are the experts? Who could they be?
I'd always before just kind of read this to be the Jews, but I mean, I take it you're going in a little bit of a different direction.
Well, I'm going more specific than just Jews in general. Who are the experts among the Jews? The Pharisees. That's exactly right. Who would even be more expert than that? As you funnel it down, scribes were a part of that. Now you're talking, I think. Is this the Sanhedrin? Is this the voting group? The Sanhedrin, apparently 70. Some manuscripts make you think it's 72. But these are 70 men who are the courtroom of the Jewish people. And who rejected Jesus? The Jews' court, the Sanhedrin. They rejected him, the leaders. And all during his ministry, it was the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees who were competing against him all the time. They didn't want him. They rejected him over and over until finally they made the final ruling. And I think Peter is probably saying it that way. So that now where these Christians find themselves, it's an interesting situation. They find that Jesus was rejected by the leaders of the Jews. And now these Christians have been rejected by the leaders of the Gentiles and kicked out, made to move. Why? Because you're following Jesus. So, this Jesus, he has become the chief cornerstone. Why would he become that? I thought he was that.
The law was the foundation of the Jewish people, and then he became the cornerstone of the new law.
Yes, and why does it use the term he became the chief cornerstone? Why that terminology rather than he was the chief cornerstone? What's his point?
On that road.
And he lived, he was faithful to it. He had to live it and become it. I mean, he was that. He was sent for that purpose, but he had to fulfill it. So he was, but he had to fulfill it, right? So he became the chief cornerstone. And here's two other things. He is a stone of stumbling. Now, the word stumbling refers to something that you encounter by accident. The stone of stumbling. My parents were living in Knoxville, Tennessee. They took us to a cave that a man had developed on his property many, many years before. And in that cave, as he entered, he dedicated this cave to evolutionists, but he was a creationist. And as we came in, the cave had been open, I think, 10, 15 years, something like that, a cavern. And as we came in, the very first thing we came to was what he called the stone of stumbling. And of course, he defines what or why it was called that. He said, we had been open for a while, and we brought somebody from the University of Tennessee in their geology department to come and tell us, said, this is really cool. I want you to come tell us, read this stone and figure out how old this cave, this cavern is. Well, he was excited about that. Wonderful. And he did all of his calculations and he did all of his measurements and testing, and turned out to be X number of millions or whatever years old. Wow. And I own this cave in my yard. And then he looked at him and he said, that's fascinating. Said, we opened this cave about 15 years ago and it wasn't here. Whoops. He calls it the stone of stumbling. Because now these supposed experts have figured out that this cave is really, really old and wow, a tribute to evolution. No. Top, bottom, yes, stalagmite.
Not a stone, but a dripping.
Yes, very good. Yeah, it was not a stone that came rolling in or down. Very good. A stalagmite. Is that right? Stalactite is from the top. Stalagmite is from the bottom. Yep. Because if they connect, it might be a stalactite. Is that how it works? No? Becomes a column then, right? Okay. It's over, yeah. I just say stuff like that to get people going. Are you impressed? That's the whole reason I do it. All right, so Jesus is the stone of stumbling, what you accidentally fall over. But then he's also a rock of offense. Now this word, offense, is a trap. How does it make you feel that God set a trap with Jesus? Does that bother you? Have you ever thought of Jesus as coming in his life was a trap? Are you bothered or are you just stunned? What is it? Stunned. That's what it says, all right? Yeah. The point is the very thing that Jesus was became a trap. It wasn't that God was setting a trap. It was the fact that how they treated him entrapped them. The very life that we buy into and that people did then, we don't perceive it to be a trap. Do you believe you're trapped into being a Christian? Have you ever felt trapped into Christianity? No. Why? Because to you, it's a haven, right? But to them, it's a trap because of the way they have treated it or treated him. So now he's saying that he is the chief cornerstone. He's where it all begins, and the whole new law begins. The whole new concept, the whole new covenant begins with Jesus, and he fulfilled it. The old law started the new one. And his life, some stumble over by accident, and others are trapped by it. Why? Look at the next end of the verse. They stumble, being disobedient to the word, to which they also were appointed.
It seems to me like
You talk about the experts. Christ was so humble and meek. He became a trap or a stumbling block to those who thought too highly of themselves. And he was welcoming and hopeful about people who were naturally humble and meek and felt like I don't have the answers. So they rejoiced to see the answers in someone where the answers didn't suit the expert.
No.
Because it didn't include them in a position of preeminence.
There you go. That's exactly right. They were trapped. I think Scripture presents people like those who rejected Jesus as the leaders, the experts. I think the Bible presents them as people who are trapped by their own designs. It's not that God or that Jesus said, I'm going to lay this trap and hope you get caught. Not that at all. But it becomes a trap for them because it challenges them at their very basis to who they are. I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul talks about God has chosen the weak things of the world to do what? Come on. To do what? To confound the wisdom of the world. So, is God setting a trap hoping they will fall? No. Just like the concept that says in this evolutionary term, the reason people who don't believe in creation can't buy the concept of the age of the earth is I've heard them say, well, if what you're saying is true, then God was playing a joke. He was tricking us. What do you mean, tricking us? Well, because he made an earth that when you read it, when you take geology samplings and you read it, it's older than it actually was. So it's a trap. It's tricking. And I say, well, so what you're saying is it's not fair that God created Adam and Eve full grown. Because if you'd have tested them, they were pretty well full grown. And it's not fair if God had made trees in the garden and had rings in it. Not fair because the rings would make you be, supposedly, you can count those rings and know the years and the age. Yeah. So it's not fair that God created a tree that has rings in it so that you would be tricked if it had fallen down. You count them, that it's that old when he just now made it. That's not fair. And it's not fair that when he made everything out in the universe, that the stars were there and you could see them immediately, when in fact we know that light travels at a certain speed, and it would have taken X number of thousands of years to get from the farthest star to here. And that's a trap. It's not a trap, but it is a trap if you let it be, right? And that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. That's the kind of stuff, it seems to me, that God put in place, not for the purpose of trapping people into falling, but rather, if you are so sold on yourself, And if you've got all the answers figured out and you know it all, and then you encounter the things of God, if you're not being able to be humble, then that's going to be your trap.
React the way everybody does, and almost anything to change. May challenge the way you are, get defended. It doesn't matter if it's Christianity or same sports team or whatever it is.
That's true.
When somebody starts telling you something and starts making you question yourself, you're not defending, getting defended.
Yeah, I think we all do that. You're exactly right. And so the question is, are you going to buck up and continue to defend your position, or are you going to say, I was wrong? And the ones who say, I was wrong, well, those are the ones who accept Jesus as the chief cornerstone. All right, let's look at verse 9. But you, the ones who've accepted him, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Notice what he says. You are an elect race, a chosen generation. Why would that perk up the ears of Peter's readers? Elect race. Why that might perk them up?
The actions here in the preceding verses and this verse mirrors in the book of Exodus what we're just talking about with rock of offense is exactly what God did through the plagues.
That's a good point.
Many times, and I don't want to divert the flag.
No, that's good.
From
That's
Pharaoh, but
very good.
well, I say that because every time I'm in a class where there's discussion of God and Pharaoh, there's a discussion of how was Pharaoh's heart hardened? Did God harden his heart, or did Pharaoh harden his own heart? Yes, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, not directly. Otherwise, we got a big problem biblically, but indirectly through the events of what Pharaoh saw, just like what we're talking about with the religious leaders of Jesus. But anyway, with God and Pharaoh, the text in Exodus also says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
Yes, it does.
It was purely on Pharaoh's desire to do what he wanted to do. Now, when they left Egypt after the plague, after God brought Egypt to its knees, they left. They come to Mount Sinai, and in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, which is exactly the same as verse 9. But you are an elect race, a holy nation, a priesthood, a people for mine own possession. So these Jewish readers, these Jewish Christian readers, when Peter says verse 9, I believe they would, without a doubt in my mind, and without hesitancy to them, they would recall God through Moses saying, you are an elect race, a royal priesthood, which is exactly what Peter's saying to them, of course, not as Jews, but as Christians. As Christians, we are an elect race, a royal, holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people for mine own possession, called out of darkness into his marvelous light. There's a parallel between the Old Testament, not just from the preceding verses of what God has done through to Pharaoh, and thus Pharaoh rejected what God was doing. And then now Jesus being rejected by the Jewish leaders and the Jewish nation. There's a parallel.
Oh, that's outstanding.
The Christian readers.
Oh, I don't have any doubt that's what they were thinking. You're exactly right. That's the whole point, I think, of the elect race. And in the same way that they felt as an elect race, how did the Jews feel? They were special. They were really God's possession. And the difference was they were God's possession and nobody else could have it. But now he's saying, you're my special possession and everybody should be that way. Because why? You're called out of darkness to proclaim his praises. That word special is a word that means the flock. You are the flock. You are my flock. And we are to proclaim his praises. So, unlike the Jews who cloistered it to themselves, locked it away and said, we're God's special people, we don't want anybody else to be involved. He's telling these people, these Christians, you are my special people, but don't you hold it to yourself. You go out there and proclaim it. Let everybody know about who God is, his marvelous light. Hosea had said, formerly not a people, but now a people, when he had the wives and the children, Lo-Ami and Lo-Ami and Lo-Ruhamah. Okay, not a people, now a people. That's what the terminology is. And he says, you were not a people, but now you're the people of God because you've obtained mercy. In fact, the end of the text of the verse, you now have obtained mercy, is what is called an aorist tense, meaning a past event. He is looking to an event, one event that says, now you're the people of God. And I think that event is chapter 1, 22 and 23. You purified your souls and you were born again. That event made you my people. That moment in time. That's why it is not proper to teach that a person is a child of God and then baptized some other time, if baptism is the place that makes you in Christ. And it's that moment. It's an event. It's not a process in the particular. That moment. You stand there a sinner, you are baptized, and you come out forgiven. That moment, you move from unsaved to saved, lost and found. So he's talking about you are now the people of God. Mm-hmm.
We started talking about the Jews in the beginning, and him being the stumbling block. And we come down here and we talk about God's people and chosen people. Are we talking about then all people, not just the Jews?
Yes. Yeah. Now he's talking to Christians. He said, the Jews rejected me through their leaders, but now Jews and Gentiles are my people through the avenue of being born again. That's exactly right. So look at verse 11 and 12. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Beloved, I beg you. And here's a commentator made this interesting statement. The word which war against the soul. He said it means which very ones. These very things war against the soul. So fleshly lusts, these very things, war against your soul. Well, that's interesting because there was a group that developed in this century, the first century, later on into the second, that said, what you do in the body doesn't matter. It can't harm your soul. It can't harm you spiritually. Physically has nothing to do with spiritual. As long as it's your spirit, the body is corrupt, the body is bad, and therefore what you do with the body is of no consequence. It's what you do with your spirit and your soul. That's not what Peter says. Peter says, these very things, these fleshly lusts, those things war against the soul. I think it's interesting, he says in verse 12, keep your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. When Paul, that is, and Peter use the word Gentiles, they're using it in a disparaging way. Because the word Gentile means those who don't believe, those who oppose. And yet, it's very likely that some of these people to whom he's writing are Gentile Christians. Maybe predominantly Jewish Christians, but certainly Gentile Christians, and certainly you and me. As far as I know, everybody in here is a Gentile Christian. And if that's the case, and he's really saying, you know how those Gentiles are. Well, that's the way they use the term. And so they would understand what he means by that. And those who were Gentile Christians, they could buck up and say, well, don't you beat on me like that. And yet, that's true. You know, that's your former group. But you are not that anymore. By your good works, they will glorify God in the day of visitation. That word visitation is interesting. I'll tell you the Greek word, you tell me if it sounds interesting, sounds familiar to you. Episkopos. You ever heard the word episkopos? What does it sound like? Episcopalians is what it sounds like. Well, that's the same word. Do we use that term in the church? Episkopos? We should, because you were one. And you were one. And you are one. What's an episkopos? That's an elder. We call it elder. It's a bishop, a shepherd. That's the term. So, what does he say? They will glorify God in the day of shepherding. What's this day of visitation? Got any idea? Got to be enough time for them to glorify God.
I would like to take a guess.
Go right ahead.
I would guess that it means the day when Jesus lives among us, as far as living in our hearts.
That's a good way of putting it. So as he is living, it's his shepherding of us, as it were, living amongst us. Anybody else?
A different thought, but I like that too. That's interesting. The beginning part, I think what he's saying in these two verses is, and there's application for today, because today that put in place a big separation between what happens in the body and what happens in the soul. The spirit,
Yes.
the body and the spirit and the body.
Mm-hmm.
And the principle is you can't live like the world. You can't have 1 foot in the world, 1 foot in the church.
Right.
And it is absolutely wrong for Christians to live in such a way that even the Gentiles don't live that way. Even the world doesn't live that way. I think of 1 Corinthians 5, you had your father's wife, and you ought to be ashamed of something about the word of God. It's not even named among the
Not a name, that's right.
I think that's what's happening here. And when the word that you gave the detail on, the visitation, it takes a life to develop a characteristic in others.
It does indeed.
And part of the characteristic is reputate good rapport within and without. That happens over time. And so when a person becomes a shepherd, those inside the church and those outside who know that person, they say, yeah, that's a good man. Or that's a good family.
Doesn't shepherding also take on the form of discipline from time to time? And pulling back together. Listen to these words. If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. They will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Jesus' words about the city of Jerusalem. The concept of visitation is when, apparently, it seems, when God enters in and disciplines. That's shepherding, to discipline. Maybe because Peter seems to have been written in the mid-60s, I wonder if he is actually talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that when it happens, people will actually glorify God. Interesting. I don't know. I like what you guys have said. I like that one too. So, I don't know. But at least that's something to think about, something to chew on.
One little additional thing. These people he's writing to, the vast majority of them never laid eyes on him.
That's right.
I mean, obviously there were probably a few who walked with him.
Yeah, sure.
Sat and listened to him, but the vast majority never laid eyes on him. So this concept of accepting Jesus and allowing him to live in your heart is our way of being able to walk with Jesus.
That's right.
Talk with him and have him present himself before us.
And that's my day of visitation, when I take on, when I'm born again. I mean, it fits. What you're saying absolutely fits.
And when he says your day of visitation,
Yeah.
there are others who've already had their day of visitation.
Mm-hmm.
Their day of visitation has already come upon them.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's your day of visitation.
Could very well be. I want to close with the next word in verse 13, therefore. Now, what he's going to talk about is submission. He's going to say, therefore, submit. And this is not going to be, as it were, a fun topic, because we live in a country that's very hard to submit right now. But what he's saying is, therefore, you submit to every ordinance of man. Why? Because you need to live in such a way that the Gentiles can be made to glorify God. That's the whole point. So how we live a submissive attitude and yet not giving in and giving up principle. Does that have any recollection, you think, to the living stone, standing firm, but still living a submissive life? You think about that for next week. We'll start in verse 13.